Dear colleagues, thank you so much for taking our invitation. We would like to apologize for shifting the time of our press conference. The reason was Mr. Galstyan was at the National Parliament. Today at the board meeting of the CBA, it was decided to keep the refinancing rate unchanged. Mr. Galstyan will present and then you can ask your questions. Thank you. Thank you. At the June 17, 2025 meeting, the board of the Central Bank of Armenia decided to keep the key policy rate unchanged at 6.75%. In the second quarter of 2025, the May growth was accelerated and it amounted at 2.8%. In the second quarter of 2025, the risks associated with a further slowdown in global demand and in Armenia's key partner economies increased, while inflationary pressures intensified in the US. Uncertainty surrounding US economic policy in particular, and trade policy as well, and its macroeconomic implications remain elevated. On the other hand, heightened tensions in international trade relations alongside with a sharp escalation of geopolitical conflicts, particularly in the Middle East, have significantly increased the risks of potential disruptions of supply and value chains. Insignificant uncertainty persists regarding the medium-term implications of the US fiscal policy, particularly the magnitude of aggregate demand support, the consequent increase in public debt, and in the potential upward of long-term interest rate. Within this context, given the stringent conditions of partner countries and persistent growth of prices, it is likely that the central banks in major economies are expected to either maintain or ease tight monetary policy conditions at a gradual pace. In the second quarter of 2025, economic activity in Armenia slowed down primarily due to the gradual dissipation of certain short-term non-structural growth drivers. The continued strong growth in the construction and services sector has remained as a key driver. At the same time, uncertainty remains elevated regarding the sustainability of this growth, its long-term trajectory, and the future path of domestic demand. With regard to services, external demand continues to decline. The impact of aggregate demand on inflation is assessed to be neutral, while the recent acceleration in inflation is largely driven by certain supply-side factors. In this context, labor market conditions are showing signs of cooling, as evidenced by the gradual stabilization of wage growth, sticky price inflation in non-state trade sectors. At the same time, fiscal policy poses primarily inflationary risks over the mid-term run. In the context of current macroeconomic developments, the financial market participants in Armenia generally anticipate that the Central Bank of Armenia will gradually lower the refinancing rate over the coming year, aiming to reach the 6.25% level. Given the above-mentioned risks and the heightened uncertainty, the board has assessed multiple scenarios in its policy. On one hand, it discussed A-type scenarios, including those related to geopolitical developments, as well as the policy dynamics in the US and Armenia, which could lead to increase in Armenia's neutral interest rate. These scenarios would require a higher path for the policy rate relative to market expectations and price stability. On the other hand, the board discussed B-case scenarios, which involve the risk related to continued normalization of external demand and a further weakening of aggregate demand. And this envisages market expectations and faster weakening of interest rate. And this is also anchoring inflation near the target of a midterm run, consequently emphasizing the build-up of case A-type risks, the board of the Central Bank of Armenia resolved to keep the refinancing rate unchanged in the current period. The board will continue monitoring the economic scenario developments and is ready and committed to adopt the relevant policy actions and strategy to ensure 3% inflation in the mid-term run. Questions, please. Arca News Agency, Nune Manasyan. How resilient is the banking system of Armenia given external shocks, in particular tensions between Iran and Israel? In our previous meetings as well, we have been mentioning that our goal is to bring capitalization of our banking system to a level which allows us to be resilient to external shocks. You know that anti-cyclic buffers were increased by 1.85%. It was enacted from May this year. This is additional capital of 50 billion. Within this context, since we are getting daily updates, and I would say hourly updates on the developments globally, at the moment we don't have any challenges in being resilient towards the risks. Thank you. My second question is, are you going to reconsider the outlook of Armenia's economic development if the tensions continue to get stronger? We spoke of both scenarios, and in both scenarios we try to consider the conflicts, of course, not at the high level of profoundness that we will have in the future, because this is still so fresh now. Nevertheless, in A and B types of scenarios, we entail certain logic of it here. What I mean is, if a situation happens when the conflict switches to a deeper, more profound or longer phase, in this case the general region becomes riskier, we will have the disruption of supply chains, value chains for goods coming to the region. I've mentioned this already. Secondly, this can have an impact on the tourism flows. Number three, this can have an impact on the risk premium of our region. That is to say, we see here an entire bunch of A-type risks, and as mentioned, we have responded to this by stating that A-type risks have grown in their numbers. Second thing is B-type risks, whereby we can encounter a situation when our economy gets weaker. Our trade relations or some other similar issues that can have a negative impact on the internal demand on our market. And of course, there are more scenarios that we're going to consider in the future, but within these scenarios, at least within this short period of time, we tried to fit in certain logic. I'll finalize my question. Are there any financial institutions in Armenia who are willing to get the license from the CBA for their financial activity at the moment? Do you mean new banks? Do you mean obtaining new banking license, and do we have applications or not? We don't at this moment. Okay. And if there are applicants, will the central bank consider those applications? If there are institutional applicants, with great pleasure, we will consider their applications and we will try to work with them. We're always ready to accept new institutional players to the Armenian market. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Galstyan. The experience in such situations shows that the so-called investor caution depends on how strong and long it may take. I mean, the conflict if it is resolved in a short period of time, can we assume that even in these circumstances, the cautiousness of international investors in the region will remain with a certain lag of time in the future as well, and it will have a negative impact on the region and on us? Well, this reminds me of a joke which says everything is possible. Anything is possible. I can tell you now about the scenarios that prove what you just said, but I can also present a dozen of scenarios which prove that this will not happen. The thing is, we are on the verge of economy and psychology here, because the behavior of investors is caused by rational concerns, but it can also be driven by fears that are beyond the field of the rational. And so fortune telling at this point is really an ungrateful business to do. What I think we need to continue doing is to persistently focus and inform our partners about the following. Armenian economy, having gone through multiple challenges in the last few years, was able to withstand, and we didn't disrupt the macroeconomic stability whatsoever. That is to say, the commitment given by the Armenian government within the framework of the fiscal scope and the CBA's commitments on macroeconomic growth were met even in the most challenging situations. And I believe that this made us, to some extent, immune to navigate through these situations. Please. Well, can we assume that risk factors haven't been that relevant in the past, and they were caused by the fuel rate fluctuations and logistic change disruptions? Otherwise, you would have increased the interest rate. When we publish the minutes of meeting of the board, you will familiarize yourself with the logic of the board, and you will see that there are views there that are pretty close to the ones of yours. And yes, there were some predictions about the disrupted supply chains, but we have documented it in this one sentence, saying that A-type risks got bigger in number, and A-type risks are related to circumstances that predict a higher interest rate than the market does. For the sake of being fair, I have to say that the outlook that was mentioned in bullet points, and I read it out, this moderately slow down reduction scenario, this scenario was devised when the Israeli-Irani conflict hadn't happened yet. So there's a discrepancy here. Can we assume, to the extent in which the Fed's activity has an impact on us, can we assume that you assume that interest rate will not be reduced because of the recent events, although it was pre-planned? Well, I have to divide the answer into two parts. One is about long-term fundamental issues related to the fiscal policy, size of debt, debt servicing, the level of interest rate, which will be translated into various corners of the world. And the second thing is about the possible risks as a result of this conflict. I would say that the first factor has higher value, because we need to understand whether or not there's a scenario under which the US will reduce its deficit, the debt serving. This will be a positive signal to the markets. Otherwise, as far as the short-term developments are concerned, it will be wrongful and ungrateful to make any predictions now, because the events are developing hour by hour, minute by minute. We just need to watch and follow to understand what's going to happen. Any other questions, please? It has been mentioned here that the external demand towards services continues to decline. What is the reason? And my second question is, what can we expect on the mortgage market, considering the paces of construction and surplus of offer on the market? Well, there could be some risks on the market, and in fact, at the previous conference on fiscal policy, I have mentioned about certain cooling of the construction and real estate market. As for the continuous weakening of external demand, you can see that on the left, we can see the tourism flows to Armenia. In fact, in May, we had certain growth, but in the months before the month of May, we had a certain decline of visitors to Armenia. And this was the reason why we assumed that the external demand could be somehow weakened. Sputnik, please. I wanted to ask you a question about the components of price growth. In the last months, according to the Statistics Committee data, the non-regulated services prices remained quite high. However, this happened randomly. That is to say, when we had an influx of the Russian citizens in 2022, the restaurant and hospitality business was open to host them, and the GDP there was quite for that part was quite high. I don't know how relevant it is for the Central Bank of Armenia, but the picture now doesn't look like the one 3 years before. And does this prompt you about any changes in the fundamentals of the price growth? My resilience can prompt you that at the moment we're not worried about 4.3% of price growth, because it is largely caused by certain supply factors, that is to say seasonal, non-seasonal food stock. There are some groups of products like fruits and vegetables that showed some price growth. Of course, this growth will be then changed by certain decline, and this is seasonal. And even in our statements, we do not even mention those topics with a concern, because in fact, we do not see that this is a demand-driven price fluctuation. In the course of time, this is going to be restored, and we believe that the target of 3% that we had will be met in midterm run. Factor, please. Good afternoon, Mr. Galstyan. At one of the previous board meetings, as you referred to the mortgage market, you said that in December there was a sharp growth, and you said that the program was closed and it would still take time to understand in which direction the mortgage program will go. Does the central bank know now what to expect from mortgage? And my second question is, let me ask you about the reduction of numbers of the tourists from Russia that you mentioned previously. Is this indicative to longer term changes in Armenian economy? If you do this analysis, of course, that is to say, will labor force be moved from one sector to another? At the moment, we do not see the structural changes that you described in your question, because in May, the number of tourists grew. I don't know what's the breakdown by countries from where the tourists arrive. I do not know for sure if the number of tourists from Russia in May grew as compared with the same month of the last year. I can't tell you that, but we have a growing number of tourists from China, Korea, and others. We have smaller number of tourists from these countries. However, the dynamics of growth is much high. So we may anticipate some structural changes in the mix of tourists in terms of the countries where they come from. As for the mortgage portfolios, in fact, mortgage loans in December 2024 compared with the same period of the previous year amounted to 2.8%. This is as of end of the year. Yes. Do you think it's a lot or not so much? At the moment, I think it's a normal figure because if you remember, in December they did a front log. We were supposed to have January and February as much weaker months and more vibrant May to April, etc. We have certain growth in these months compared to December, which is normal. Sputnik, please. Well, perhaps this question was raised at the previous meetings, but still, if we look at the consumer loan portfolio, and if it continues growing at a high pace now, why don't you think that the demand-driven price growth component is not risky now? Well, this is what the estimates show, because the components that are driven by demand and therefore they entail price growth, it's the services, the blue part on the table. It remains unchanged for quite a long time. We came back to the situation when the non-exporting goods, they show us a stable dynamics, and the gray part is seasonal fluctuations in food sector. Labor market, any signs of heating? No. On the contrary, it is cooling down. This is the wages graph, and the yellow curve shows the non-extractables, and in parallel to this, the pace of price growth is going down as well on annualized basis. It's not the absolute numbers of the wages that are going down, but the growth paces are normalized. That is to say, they are proportional now. Yes, compared to productivity. Yes, indeed. As for fiscal, capital construction projects, do you look at the price growth risks in terms of capital construction or any? Well, the scenarios are different, and I will ask Haik to present them, please. Thank you so much. We are considering several scenarios depending on the current expenditure programs by the Armenian government and different social programs that are going in parallel, plus the possible challenges in tax collections. This is our first scenario, whereby the boosting effect on the economy can be quite significant, and there are scenarios that are related to the prospects of capital expenditures. Historically, we had challenges with that. And also the structure of capital expenditures. In the structure of capital expenditures, we have specific groups that, in terms of multiplier effect on the economy, are very insignificant. So in parallel to this, these capital expenditures will not have a significant boosting effect on the economy, and their effect will be quite reserved. Let me remind you that according to the midterm plan of the Armenian government in terms of expenditures, it was recently published, some precisions were made in terms of the implications of the 2025 budget on the economy, and it is assessed as neutral. I think depending on the scenario which is materialized, we will either have a boosting or neutralizing effect on the economy. Thank you. Questions? Thank you so much, and once again, my apologies for the delay in time.